everyone, this is Yuki bringing you a basic tactics video for Commands and Colors Napoleonics. Today we will discuss the very basics of unit positioning. This is one of the topics that was requested by one of the viewers directly, and I really appreciate the suggestion. I am always grateful for these video topic suggestions, so please continue to let me know what kind of videos you would like to see. Unit positioning in this game is a rather large topic and is very context dependent. This video will aim to describe some of the very basic principles that are largely applicable to most beginner games. These principles are meant to be used as tools to approach different situations rather than to be memorized and shoehorned into every scenario. So always keep in mind that it's more about how to think about things and less about what to memorize. As you know, I am not a big fan of those big walls of text with many paragraphs talking about vague general concepts riddled with obscure and irrelevant historical references that have nothing to do with the game. I really like concrete examples, especially for games like Commands and Colors. You can talk about general concepts all day and no one can prove you wrong, but I just don't think those things are really helpful to anyone because this game is very concrete. So let's just jump straight into an example and I will explain everything along the way. On the screen, you see the very first scenario set up in the base game, Rally Set 1. Many of you are probably already familiar with this scenario. In terms of positioning, I'm sure all of you already know that you should put your units in defensive terrain as much as you can, and avoid putting your units into terrains that are detrimental to them. We will not spend too much time on the terrain effects because you can simply read about them from a chart that came with the game. But beyond this, what are some of the basic goals in positioning? Let's pretend that we're the first player in the scenario, the British player. So first thing I would like to do is to visualize the map in a way where I've identified which hexes are threatened by enemy attack. The biggest threat in this game, at least by a frequency of appearance, is the stationary infantry ranged attack. They are usually at least equal to the number of blocks, which is normally 4 at full strength. This allows each infantry unit to carve out an area 2 hexes away that discourage enemy unit entry. The next threat on the list is artillery range attack. The power of the artillery attack dissipates the further it gets, but the range is extensive, so in a lot of scenario setups, the artillery units can actually hit something even on turn 1. Adding up the range coverage of all the range units together, we can visualize how much of the map is collectively threatened by enemy stationary range attack. Here the light blue shades show the parts of the map that are threatened by enemy units. Of course, the melee attack also make up parts of the threat zone, but because the area is continuous, the more relevant areas closer to our units are still covered by range attack. Note that we're also taking terrain dice reduction into considerations. So hexes that are within range but have 0 attack dice, such as some of the forest hexes here, are not included in the threat zone illustration. The purple hexes indicate parts of the threat zone that contain our own units, and in this case is the 1 line infantry unit and 2 foot artillery units. The next component of the enemy threat zone is the reach of cavalry units. It consists of all the possible areas that can be attacked by enemy cavalry units when taking cavalry movement into consideration. Here on the screen, we're showing all the possible hexes that can be attacked by the French light cavalry on the left side of the map. Notice that because it has a maximum movement of 3, the zone that it threatens is 4 hexes away because, remember, we care about which hexes it can attack and not which hexes it can move to. Similarly, here we see the threat zone of the right French light cavalry. Notice that when you try to visualize this, you should take into account of the terrain restrictions. For example, even though the forest hex is within light cavalry's threat zone, which is 3 hexes away, it actually cannot attack into the river hex northeast of it because cavalries entering the forest have to stop and cannot battle. So this is something you need to keep track of as well. Taken together, We see that at the beginning of this scenario, the French threat zone looks like this. Here we are overlaying the two different colors, one for cavalry and one for infantry plus artillery. This is important because cavalry threat zones are particularly dangerous to lone infantry. It's best that your infantry units do not enter these zones all by themselves because the cavalries can force them into squares, and the chance of unsquaring is very slim if the infantry has no other units around to deter the cavalry. So based on this picture, there are some observations that we can make. First of all, there are 3 units in these purple hexes that the enemies can actually attack from turn 1. So maybe we should consider relocating them to avoid getting hit. But the one important thing to note here is that these hexes are affected by artillery ranged attack, and only 1 die. If you would like to review artillery ranged attack, I have a video talking about the attack probabilities, so feel free to go back and watch it again. But the main point here is that it is in general a weaker threat, so whether you want to actually move away from these hexes is not so urgent, especially because it's all coming from a single foot artillery unit. If you have the right cards, then you should go ahead and do that, but if not, you don't really need to warp your entire strategy just to do this. The other observation is that the French light cavalry on the left side of the screen has incredible reach because that part of the map is relatively flat, so it's free to move around. And we see that it's a little too close to the Portuguese infantries that are not in a good defensive formation. So in addition to avoiding the cavalry threat zones, we can also consider consolidating the formations on this side of the map so that the units are not isolated from each other and at least have some ways of responding if the cavalry decides to harass them. Lastly, we see that there are certain hexes on the board that are not being threatened by the French, that also happen to have defensive terrains on them, such as the forest and the hill hexes being outlined here. In fact, some of these are immediately accessible by our own units on turn 1. Occupying these hexes will extend our own threat zone. So it's an attempt to win this tug of war of trying to control more parts of the map than your opponent. The units you use to occupy these offensive positions also matter because, for example, if you move the light infantry into the nearest forest hex here, the 2 range zone that it covers has an attack of 5 to 6 dice, which is far more than what the artillery unit is currently covering. Okay, now let's try to do the same kind of analysis for the French side. Now, using the same method, we're showing the British threat zone of ranged units, and right off the bat, there are 4 French units on the hills that are affected by it, highlighted in purple. Next, using the same method, we're highlighting the cavalry's reach from the Portuguese light cavalry and from the British heavy cavalry, which is, as you can see, very limited by the terrain. And here is the overlay showing the collective British threat zone. So now, as the French player, what are some of your early game positioning goals? Try to do this as an exercise by using what we talked about so far. You can pause the video if you want to spend more time thinking about it, and then we can go over some of the possible answers. Okay, so first we see that 4 French units on the hills are within the enemy threat zone. Some of these hexes are covered by 1 enemy artillery unit, but some are covered by 2. So unlike the previous example with the British, I think it's actually worth considering moving away some of these units at least, especially when both of the enemy foot artilleries are in the same section and are frequently ordered together. Next, we can check the enemy cavalry's reach. As we said before, we probably don't need to worry about the heavy cavalry too much right now, and the light cavalry doesn't have too much access to our infantries, and our infantries are actually clustered together. So the chance of driving away the cavalry to unsquare is relatively high. But if we do want to enter the cavalry's threat zone in the future, we should make sure that the units have adequate support so they don't get picked off and get stuck in a square. The next thing to do is to look for protective terrain hexes that are also outside of the enemy threat zones. that we can occupy to carve out new areas to expand our own threat zones. Some of the good options here are the town of Rolisa on the right, the forest nearby, and the hills on the right map edge. Though the British will most likely get to this one before we do. But it is still a possibility depending on what cards your opponent has. Okay, so as usual, here's our summary slide. So here I separated the positioning into defensive and offensive positionings. But these are relative terms because even the quote-unquote offensive ones are more about controlling the map and less about killing the enemy units. So please keep this in mind. Anyway, defensive positioning here involves moving away from enemy threat zones, including the units that are actually within the threat zones at the start of the scenario. And how urgent it is depends on how many attack dice the units can potentially suffer. For example, if it's a faraway artillery, then it's probably not so urgent. But if it's like something much stronger and closer, or a threat zone established by multiple enemy units, then you should address it sooner rather than later, either by moving away or by engaging in attacking the enemy units. I'm sure you have seen scenarios where initiating the attack actually pays off more, so moving away from the enemy threat zones is not always the right answer. Next, if you can, try to occupy favorable terrains, which is pretty self-explanatory. So for offensive positioning, you want to advance and take positions to expand your own threat zones, and ideally this doesn't also put your units in the enemy threat zones. But again, all of this is relative. For example, if you're using the light infantry to carve out a 2 hex area of 4 to 5 attack dice, while risking a 1 die attack from the enemy artillery that is far away, then it's probably a good trade depending on how important that position is to you. Also, keep in mind that not all threat zones are created equal. Even if some of the coverage is redundant, you would want to expand your threat zones with a larger number of attack dice. So you want to carve up the map with the strong zones, like firing from light infantry for example. And lastly, occupy favorable terrain. When this coincides with your offensive positioning, it can be particularly effective because you're both expanding your threat zone and you are putting your units in cover, and we already showed several examples of this. For cavalry threat zones, you have to remember that you shouldn't let your lone infantry units enter them without support, so it doesn't get picked off by cavalry and get stuck as a square. And finally, unit positioning is more about gaining upsize in a more passive way. Once the actual combat begins, in mid-game, you shouldn't obsess with these concepts and should instead focus on the direct combat dynamics like the things we talked about in our other videos that deal with combat tactics. Okay, this is the end of the video on the basics of unit positioning. Hopefully this has been helpful to you guys. As always, let me know what topics you would like me to cover, and please consider joining my Discord server. I have the link in the video description. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.